interesting discussion. And I see a lot of you have joined. Thank you so much, Moose Gal and Buddy and Rich. Thank you for joining. I have a lot of information today. And I started out with that little video clips, compilation that I made so that we could at least get right into the issue. This is the appropriate time. The time is now. Uh, the time is absolutely now. George Floyd's funeral is today. There are marches all over the entire world against police brutality. But police brutality isn't the only injustice. Environmental racism is a huge injustice. Environmental racism is where people that are poor, Black, brown, they get the brunt of all of industrialized civilization's garbage, crap. Rural areas too, trust me. So I'm going to start out seriously with something that I got off of, it's a brand new article which got me to thinking about this whole mess. And I'm going to start out with this. I'm going to show it to you. And it was from E&E News. Now, E&E News is a pretty good, you have to subscribe to E&E News. Let me see how it looks. You have to subscribe to this, but I have a password because I don't have too many subscriptions to anything because they are expensive. This actually, E&E News, they really wanted to cost like $1,000 a month. I mean, a year, $1,000 a year. And usually the big organizations that write their articles will use E&E, so you can always get something from them. Hopefully we can see this whole thing and see how the first thing, population of top 10 counties for disasters, 81% minority. Now, I'm not going to read everything because I have a ton of stuff, but we're going to see how we all know that communities with large minority populations are among the most vulnerable in the U.S. and it's also in the world, really. Where do you think India's pollution is? Where the most poorest communities are. Now, this article talks about the counties and cities and neighborhoods with large Black and Hispanic residents. They're more than likely than others to suffer from events such as extreme heat and flooding because they are often the result located in damage-prone areas, and they lack the resources to recover quickly from disasters. And excuse it if the video isn't great. I got a notification again from AT&T that my stream quality would be lowered, and I'm not understanding. But after this, I'm going to call them and I'm going to really complain because I am so sick and tired of this problem. I hope you all can see the stuff I have up. It's just a shame. But anyway, it is the result of long-lived policies that clustered minorities in undesirable areas, such as floodplains, and denied them amenities like green spaces and tree canopies that could mitigate some of the effects of climate change. Now, communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are disproportionately at risk from the climate crisis, said Kate Mingoya, who has studied the environmental effects of housing discrimination as a director of capacity building at Groundwork USA, a national nonprofit. We can really face the ugly truth that there were policies of intentionally putting low-income people and people of color in neighborhoods that were dangerous. And federal data confirms the risks facing these communities. What's going on here? Everybody's fine. I have nobody blocked in the chat. All right. So these were the 10 counties that were most vulnerable to extreme heat in the United States. I mean, we don't even want to go in the world today. There's not enough time. Not enough time. Perry County, Alabama, 71% minority with 38 days of extreme heat in 2020. Projected. Could even be worse. Brooks County, Texas. I mean, we go on and on and on. I don't need to look at all of the actual specifics. I just really want you guys to tell me if the graphics are okay. I'm trying to look at it, and I am just so angry that I can't get a decent video. Hi, Jean. All right. So, but this was a really good article because they got the statistics, right? So in 10 counties that are deemed most vulnerable to disasters by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the population is average 81% minority. What is wrong with this picture? It's the same old shit, different day. It's just the same old. It is the income distribution, the widening income distribution, but it's been this way for a long time. People were protesting against PCBs in their neighborhoods a long time ago. Both agencies define a vulnerability as a community's resilient to extreme events, not the potential exposure to disasters and pandemics. And they measure it using data such as income, education levels, housing, and minority populations. So the rising risk, this really says it all, the rising risks of climate change for communities of color are gaining recognition in the U.S. as the U.S. struggles with the broad inequities against African Americans in areas such as policing and housing and employment. The death of George Floyd after a Minneapolis police officer knelt on his neck for more than 8 minutes ignited nationwide protests. Nationwide and global protests. Everybody's looking at the United States like we are really the evil empire. Except the clueless. The federal government's 2018 National Climate Assessment underscored the risk to minority neighborhoods, saying that vulnerable people, including lower income and other marginalized communities, have lower capacity to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate-related events and are expected to experience greater impacts. It is just not fair. FEMA has distributed $22 billion in emergency funding since 2004 to people in areas that were hit by a major disaster and declared eligible for federal aid. So these are the counties again. They're most vulnerable to natural disasters and pandemics. And what have we seen through this pandemic? We have seen that it is disproportionately affecting low income, Black and brown, and maybe even low income whites because of diet and the garbage food that is for sale in this country, full of additives. Terrible. Nearly 24% of the money went to people in zip codes that were a majority of the population is Black. Isn't it not? Wouldn't it be nice if they didn't have to, if that everybody could live in a place that wasn't polluted? But that's just not reality. If you're in an affluent area, you have insurance, said Beverly Wright, executive director of the New Orleans-based Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Hurricanes can affect anybody and everyone, but it's the ability to rebound that is important. So it goes on to talk about FEMA and how much money they have helped, but things have changed. Especially with the Trump administration. Things have changed. Minority neighborhoods, they have large concentration of vulnerable residents, single-parent families, children, people with limited income and education. Just because you're African American doesn't mean you're vulnerable. It's how that interacts with age, household status, gender, and income. Now, the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating the vulnerability of minority communities as the economic shutdown takes a disproportionate toll on business sectors that employ large numbers of Black and Hispanic people, such as transportation, retail, and local government. The national unemployment rate was 13.3% in May, which is an improvement from the 14.7% rate in April, according to figures released Friday. But for Black people, the unemployment rate has increased between April and May, hitting 16.8%. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So let's go down and these neighborhoods, which continues to be home for many minorities, are now prone to urban flooding and heat islands because they were developed so thoroughly. And to have few parks, open space, or tree canopies to absorb excess water. And I'm just going to go to the end because I have a ton of articles and we have a ton of discussion to have. That's going in an area that for the most part is where white people have gentrified. Black people don't live there anymore, right? Said of the areas where trees are being planted. Neighborhood beautification always seems to stop at the point where the income goes down and the color of people living there changes. It's just amazing how endemic racism works. Sometimes it stops just before it benefits Black and brown people. You know, it's really injustice. Injustice burns me. Injustice angers me. It should anger you. It should anger everybody watching this. Now, I know I don't have a huge following because I'm on at such a weird time, but it doesn't matter. I bring you quality stuff, and we talk about some quality issues. And we're going to go on because I have a lot of information today. And there was another article. Now, this is from 2018. Now, remember that article that I just put up was from 2000. It was brand new, 2020, June 8th from E&E News. So this 18, Trump's EPA. Trump's EPA concludes environmental racism is real. Duh. Look at that. Poison is the wind that blows from north and south and east. Marvin Gaye. Remember Marvin Gaye? Oh my God. He wasn't an environmental scientist, but his 1971 single, Mercy, Mercy Me, I wish I could play it without a content strike, provides a stark and useful environmental analysis complete with the warnings of overcrowding and climate change back in 1971. His song didn't explicitly mention race, but its place in Gaye's What's Going On album portrays a Black Vietnam veteran coming back to his segregated community and envisioning the hell that people endure, and it hasn't stopped. It has not stopped. So in 2018, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Trump administration continued a plan to dismantle many of the institutions built to address those disproportionate risks. Researchers embedded in the EPA's National Center for Environmental Assessment released a study indicating that people of color are much more likely to live near polluters and breathe polluted air. Specifically, the study finds that people in poverty are exposed to more fine particulate matter than people living above poverty. According to the study's authors, results at national, state, and county scales all indicate that non-whites tend to be burdened disproportionately to whites. It's so sad. It's so pathetic. The study focuses on particulate matter and a group of both natural and man-made microscopic suspensions of solids and liquid in the air that serve as air pollutants. Anthropogenic particles include automobile fumes, smog, soot, oil smoke, ash, and construction dust, all of which have been linked to serious health problems. Particulate matter was named as a known definite carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and it's been named by the EPA as a contributor to several lung conditions, heart attacks, possible premature deaths, high blood pressure, low birth weights. It just goes on and on and on. And on and on. What are you guys talking about? Oh, I don't know. Silent Spring. Yeah, Silent Spring. What a book. What a book. Rachel Carson. Uh Hi Karen, low income has to go to work. They can't live on unemployment. No. My husband's low income. He's working. Trust me. He doesn't even make 12 bucks an hour. But it's not about us. It's not about us. I'm going to go into the next thing I want to talk about. I have a bunch of stuff, but this next article was environmental injustice, and it was from 2016. Time to tackle social injustice. But have we? This is 2016, and it's an article that talks about the same things we were just talking about. We were just talking about. Um, One aspect is the effect of discrimination on the environment that the community is based in, whether due to targeted prejudice or resulting from ingrained institutional bias. The effects are too often the same. Minority residents end up living in more polluted areas with less access to green space than their minority peers. Uniontown, Alabama, which in March 2018 lost a long running civil rights challenge against a nearby toxic landfills. And the towns of the so called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River containing more than 125 petrochemical producing businesses, they're still there. And a friend, William, lives there. He's been fighting. He's a friend on that follows us. And the residents complain of a slew of health problems that they attribute to the nearby sources of environmental contamination. Uh, Let me go down here a little bit. The issues around environmental racism show that environmental and social issues cannot be neatly separated from each other. Resources, uh, you know, um, legal and financial need to be made available to those affected so that they can be heard. And they're heard now out there. Those same kids that are protesting, those same people that are protesting against police brutality, let me tell you, they are looking for a better world for all of them, all of us. If progress is going to be made, efforts will be needed to make the environmental movement more inclusive and to engage a much wider range of stakeholders. While grassroots movements in minority communities have had some success in opposing the degradation of their neighborhoods and should be commended for their willingness to speak out, they cannot keep struggling on alone. I have such hope. I have such hope now. Not a ton of hope because it's, you call it hopium. I just have some hope that what's happening today, for right now, will bring some light to the issue. Will bring some light to these people that are suffering in these communities, the Native American communities, where nobody gives a shit. They put them on reservations and they put them near these toxic plants. They frack and the water is polluted right down the road from me. Not far. Not far. Then there's a group called Green Action, and they talk about the environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement, which has broadened the perspective of environment beyond the scope of conservation and preservation of natural resources, and defined the environment as where we live, work, play, and pray, and learn. They are an intergenerational, multiracial, and international movement that promotes environmental, economic, and social justice by recognizing the direct link between economic, environmental, and health issues and demanding a safe, clean community and workplace environment. Is that too hard? Is that so hard? Environmental justice refers to the cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainability where all people can hold with confidence that their community and natural environment is safe and productive. Environmental justice is realized when all people can realize their highest potential without interruption by environmental racism or inequality. I don't know if I'll see that in my lifetime. Environmental justice is supported by decent, paying, and secure jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing and adequate health care, democratic decision making, and finally, personal empowerment. A community of environmental justice is one in which both cultural and biological diversity are respected, and where there is equal access to institutions and ample resources to grow. Well, when you think about this in other countries, let's say Brazil and what's happening with the indigenous people, is there environmental justice in Brazil? They're taking down the Amazon faster than you can take a breath. Is that environmental justice for capitalism's sake so that the West can buy palm oil, can eat the shit that's killing us? Is that environmental justice? No, it's not environmental justice. Okay, so back in 2019, another article, and there's a lot of them, but is anything happening? Climate change is environmental racism. This climate emergency affects us all, but is up to all of us to ensure that the global south doesn't continue to take the biggest hit. Now, this was in 19. So this summer has seen the UK swelter under some of the hottest days on record. While much of the media irresponsibly framed this heat wave as a good thing for the rest of us, it rang loud alarm bells of imminent environmental emergencies. These extreme temperatures leave people not only uncomfortable, they lead to death, especially among the elderly. And for rural communities in particular, the impacts of scorching heat, which dries out the land, followed by flash flooding, can destroy livelihoods. But if we've begun to reap the disturbing fallout of climate change in the UK, it's nothing compared to the damaging and life-threatening effects that the global south has been living with. They deal with famine. And it says climate change doesn't affect us all equally, with those in the developing world being far more climate vulnerable to soaring temperatures. Environmental disparities are real. The Western world has streamed ahead with plans for aviation expansion, more road building, dirty energy such as fracking, as well as the insatiable appetite for environmentally damaging foods, like I say, ignoring the impact all these have on developing countries. Meanwhile, inner city communities with higher numbers of ethnic minorities in Europe and the United States tend to deal with the environmental threats with more prosperous sectors, where the more prosperous sectors of society don't. In my region of southeast of England, where this author is writing, there are big pockets of deprivation. 25.5% of children in Crawley are living below the poverty line and have to live in the polluting shadow of Gatwick Airport. Outside of Europe, climate change is responsible for extreme weather events like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and Cyclone Inde in Zimbabwe, which obliterates homes, destroys livelihoods, and kills people. The Grantham Center for Sustainable Futures warned back in 2015 that around a third of the planet's land has been lost over the last 40 years due largely to climate disasters and poor conservations, with more than 1.3 billion people, we have too many people, living on agricultural land that is becoming less and less efficient. Failing harvests, poverty, famine, and droughts Now, they talk about climate reparations or as one way to go about undoing some of the damage, insisting that wealthier nations who are responsible for excessive carbon emissions in the first place transfer funds to poorer nations to deal with the consequences of climate change and pave the way for exciting new technologies that can transform people's livelihoods, standard of living, and the environment. Since the climate crisis is clearly the fault of the North, or Western countries, they're responsible for helping the South adapt. And they go on to talk about the Green New Deal, and they talk about, he said, Bill McKibben doesn't think that addressing climate change is impossible. He simply states that any response has to deal with the austerity and economic short-sightedness that currently paralyze our society. I would agree with that. I would completely agree with that. And I'm going to move on to the next one because now, see, what we're talking here is it's endemic, and I've now illustrated the problem and a couple of different solutions, which would be reparations for people that are affected by institutional racism and climate change that has come about from people like this. Now, Mike Pence is our vice president. I think his family had gas stations. And I'm going to read this to you. I've talked about this before. I talked about it when I think in 2017, when Donald Trump first became the president, much to my, I don't even want to go there. So I'm going to tell you that Pence, as the governor of Indiana, actively neglected a predominantly Black and Latina town whose residents were suffering from high levels of lead and arsenic contamination. According to Rewire, officials on the federal and state level knew about the contamination issues in East Chicago, Indiana, an industrial town since the 1980s. Still, it took nearly 30 years to put the city on a national list of most contaminated sites. But it gets worse. It took even more time for officials to act with any speed. Part of the reason may rest with a 2011 federal report that found that there was no health threat from the air, water, soil around the Superfund site. Liars! The Indiana Department of Environmental Management, the IDEM, cited the findings of this report when Rewire News asked the agency. They asked them about the apparent failure to respond with urgency to the contamination. But in September 2006, Reuters found that the report was based on flawed or incomplete data and was, in the words of one expert, embarrassingly bad. Meanwhile, the residents of East Chicago, they were suffering. A new report from 2018 by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry found young children in 2 contaminated East Chicago neighborhoods were 3 times more likely to have elevated lead, let's not forget about Flint, in their blood. Flint, Michigan is a huge problem still. In one public housing unit built in the 70s, more than a quarter of children tested in a 10-year span had lead levels at or over the federal threshold for intervention. And most of them were Black. Children are so much more vulnerable to lead poisoning, and they can't leave. They can't afford to leave. These problems were brought to Pence's attention while he was campaigning alongside Donald Trump in 2016. Yeah, Pence promised that his top priority remained serving the people of his home state. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. When asked directly by East Chicago's mayor to declare a state of emergency in the city, which would give local officials access to funding to help confront the crisis, Pence refused, saying such a move was unnecessary, given the level of coordination among federal, state, and local agencies. Now, it didn't change until February 2017, when Pence moved to Washington and Republican Eric Holcomb took over as governor of Indiana. He finally did make the state of emergency. But see, the story of East Chicago, it is one that it goes about, holds true, across the country. Scientists and researchers are still uncovering more of the devastatingly physical and cognitive effects of air pollution, of air pollution, many of which are long-lasting, but it's clear people of color disproportionately suffer from these conditions. And it's discriminatory housing policies, active neglect from governmental officials, that's been slowly suffocating brown and black people across the United States. And it could very well get worse before it gets better. I mean, we know that Trump's White House has gutted the EPA, basically. How many, I read the other day, I went through my video the other day, on this, and it is just heartbreaking. It makes you sick. Now, there's one more I want to talk about, and that's close to me, is Love Canal, because my husband is from the area up there. It's actually from an area called Sanborn, New York, but it was Newfane, New York, which had a toxic waste dump, and the cancer rates up in that area of Niagara County are very high, and we have lost so many people from up there to cancers. Cancers, environmental cancers. Yes, maybe some of their habits contributed, but that area is notoriously toxic. And Love Canal is one that everybody knows about because it was built on it was built on a toxic waste dump for low income, basically maybe whites. I don't remember if it was, but it was built on a toxic waste landfill. And you go back, it was really interesting. Okay, so 1942 to the early 50s, the company Hooker Electrochemical, which did employ a lot of people up there, filled in the unfinished canal with 22,000 tons of toxic waste, much of it left over from their work outfitting the military for World War II. In 1952, the Niagara Falls School Board approached Hooker and asked if the company would be willing to part with the land so that it could build a suburb and a new elementary school. See, there were people that did object. Maybe the land was safe for a park, they said, but not housing. But still, greed! 1953, Hooker sold the former canal to the school board for $1. The deed of the sale mentioned that the site was brimming with chemical waste, and that by signing the deed, Niagara Falls assumed all liability for the problems. Well, when the school board then sold the land to a housing developer in 1957, Hooker executives warned the city officials against putting houses there. But they were morons. There are dangerous chemicals buried there in drums, in loose forms, in solids, in liquids, said a Hooker representative. But didn't matter. They didn't give a shit. The developers built houses on top of it anyway. So thousands of people moved there. And they were actually low-income people. They moved there, nice neighborhood, working class, friendly. But weird things happen. When the kids threw rocks against the pavement, they exploded like firecrackers. Can you freaking imagine? Manhole covers launched themselves into the air without warning. Kids playing baseball would get a strange chemical burn like rashes when they slid across the grass. Dogs went bald. And I have to tell you, Erie County, Buffalo, Niagara County, even to this day, has a reputation of pollution. When I first moved to this area in 1993, my own mother said, "Oh my God, you're not going to live anywhere near Love Canal, are you?" And I said, "Mom, it's not like that all over. But Niagara County, unfortunately, has a lot of issues. It really does. But that was the conventional wisdom, like the whole area was polluted. And I happen to I live downstream I lived in Erie County, right off Lake Erie, down south from Buffalo. But in those days, down south where I lived at that time, Bethlehem Steel had polluted because the winds would blow all the pollution down from the steel plant. I mean, Buffalo was an industrial area. I'm not saying it's not polluted. It was polluted. So neighbors in Love Canal, they started sharing the stories, and they realized they had more than their share of miscarriages and birth defects and cancer. So in 1976, and boy, I remember this, New York State health officials started testing the area around Love Canal, and they finally found the newly formed EPA wrote a letter to the bosses in Washington warning that the area around the canal was so polluted that the state's only option was to buy up the 40 or 50 homes closest to the canal and tore them down. But of course, the local officials panicked, right? There she is. Welcome to the killing grounds. More tests made everything scarier. 82 different chemical compounds were found in Love Canal. They were in puddles. They were hiding in sump pumps, seeping through basement walls. My husband told me he knows people that lived there that died. Family members that died. Benzene, just gross shit. It was disgusting. So the state health commissioner finally said evacuate pregnant women and children under 2. But after years of rumors and unsettling data, the news of the planned evacuation made the people that lived there go from afraid to ballistic. I mean, they became organizers, and it was great. Lois Gibbs, she was the housewife who really spearheaded this whole thing at Love Canal. But what's forgotten is just how vicious the situation is. At one point, residents burned effigies of the president at the time. Everybody was just so angry. And let's see, in the interest of time, we all know the story that they took it all down, and but they really did protest. I mean, this was huge, huge. But they finally did. They did buy out the remaining 710 families, and there was 7.5 million in grants and another 7.5 million in loans so that the state could build it up, buy it up, right? For sale. Look at that. These poor people. It was really a mess. So the Superfund program came to be because of this. And there's been a lot of information, but in Niagara County, as my husband has told me, and as we have seen, people had a lot of bladder, kidney cancer, and all that. But after they left, the mortality rate did lower. So actually now in the 1990s, there are 200 homes at the outer edge of the evacuation zone were refurbished and renamed Black Creek Village. Again, they got sick. Things were not good. So for the most part, we see that our government and other governments in other countries do the same shit. Poor people, predominantly in the United States, black and brown, but I gave you an example of Niagara Falls, which was a working class white neighborhood built for profit on which they knew was toxic. Even where I live in the 80s, because this is the poorest county in New York State, in the 80s, all the activists got together and blocked a radioactive waste dump they wanted to put in this idyllic county. There is a dump here, but they wanted to put radioactive waste here. And the activists here, that some of them are still active in fighting pipelines and fighting injustice, they won because it is predominantly low-income farming land here. They didn't care, but it didn't get built. So viva 1980s. But in this time, now that we're seeing the protests around the world, This is the time when everyone should be saying, we have got to change for the short term gain. We know the long term problems may not go away. We know that, at least I know, that near term human extinction could be a thing. We're in the Anthropocene, we're watching species extinctions. We're going to watch our own extinction. Well, not we, those kids that are protesting, the younger people that we have left a real mess. And Jean says, we naked apes can stop this if we work together. And really, let's see, anybody else? Oh, with universal health care, the data, evidence of polluted locations would become obvious. Probably. And Jean, you're probably right. And I could look up more on this. I don't know if it's true, but she heard that poorer areas in all U.S. cities have water with lead in it. And that could be true because of the old pipes and the expense. And it's always up to the state taxes. You know, it's different. The federal government will give states money, which Trump doesn't like to do, and they are cutting and rolling back everything. So I don't know if that's going to happen. Scott, hi Scott, Messina, New York. Oh, I know where that is. It's pretty toxified too, especially the GM foundry site that I'm very familiar with. The Mohawk Native people downstream were pretty seriously impacted. You bet. You bet. Hi, Warren. Yeah, and Rochester as well from Kodak. All those decades making film. You can't get away from it, can you? You can't get away from it. And but there are some answers. And I think Jean she had I'm scrolling up. She had a comment that was about, well, she said Camden, New Jersey is awful too. Yeah, Camden. I looked at the picture of one of the pictures in the video I made was from Camden. But I'm looking for what Jean had said about having us bring on people that have answers and have programs and have things. So that's a future. That's a future. You know, I've been just back into making this, trying to actually do this twice a week and with Jennifer on a regular basis. I've never been able to be on a schedule. Jean says, we definitely need to learn to stick together. The change will come from mass protesting in all its forms. And that's what's happening now. That is absolutely what's happening now. And look at what Greg says after. Also, the floods in North Carolina that washed out the coal ash dumps for the fourth time. Nothing. It's right. Nothing. But there are groups. There are people out there. Environmental justice groups. And he's right. That it's going to affect upper middle class white folks. You wait 2 years, uptick in some really bad health issues. I think it's happening now. I do. And also, no coverage of the Dow Chemical plant waste storage getting washed out in the dam failures. Yeah, where's that? We'll have to follow up on that. And what's happening in the Arctic with the now this is not it's a injustice because the Arctic is being destroyed in Siberia because the permafrost is melting. Jennifer and I did our show on that. But anyway, in the interest of time, I really do appreciate you all coming. And Osama, benzene, radium, carbon tetrachloride, etc. My parents' neighbor worked at Grumman. Died of cancer. His one son died of cancer before 60, and his other son died at 70 by heart problems. We've polluted everything. We have polluted everything. We're going to talk about this, Rich. We're going to get more information and talk about the flooded waste pools. And yeah, Brian, he is destroying the Arctic. He's destroying the Arctic, and I don't even think Putin well, maybe he understands the short-term gain because he's an oligarchic, greedy person, just like Donald Trump. How can they not know the long game? How can they not know? How? But I digress. We have so many problems. I wanted to highlight this environmental racism. It happens in every place around the world. It's going to be our undoing. I just have hope that these young people that are out there that are protesting the death of George Floyd, police brutality, and will bring in environmental racism and climate change into this whole discussion, and really fight for what they want. Fight for equality, fight for fairness, fight for a different world for as long as we have. Why not? I'm going to play the video again for those of you who didn't see it. I want to thank you all for coming. And Hanford, wait, somebody said Hanford. Yeah, Hanford, that's another one. I did a live stream all about that several years ago too. On Hanford, everywhere. There is nowhere that is safe.
Environmental racism. It's about policies and practices that discriminate against communities of color by making them live near landfills, sewage plants, and other polluting facilities. And while poverty has a lot to do with it, the leading environmental justice expert told me this.
Racism trumps class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to live in more polluted neighborhoods.
Generally speaking, in this country, a lot of environmentally problematic facilities tend to be located in places where poor folks live.
The environmental justice movement is not new. It has its roots in the civil rights movement. The term environmental justice was born in 1982 in rural Warren County, North Carolina, where over 500 demonstrators were arrested protesting the location of a hazardous PCB landfill.
There's an interesting thing happening, especially when I think in terms like a Greta and like climate change, and seeing how Black and brown youth are active in this conversation, in this space. What are some of the conversations you're hearing around environmentalism and environmental justice, environmental racism, those types of topics?
That's a great comment to have. So I did spend a lot of time talking to these kids. There was this girl who was from North Carolina. Her name was Kayla, and I bring her up like in everything I've said for the past week. I had a conversation with her, and she was like, the thing I care about the most is climate change. Because there's a county in North Carolina called Dew Point, I believe, they live near a hog farm. And because of the climate changing, whenever something weird happens, a hurricane or this or that, all of the debris, the discharge from the hog farm comes into that area and makes it so they can't leave their house, they can't go to school. It's causing hurricanes in areas where we know when hurricanes happen, no one cares about the Black communities.
That's right.
And climate change was something, for me, I was like, people are being killed by the police. And that's something I think I can change more immediately than the climate. So I'm going to focus my time on that. I didn't realize how it actually affected people today. And she